This is Katty Kollwitz, who's a rather extraordinary female German expressionist artist who, with, I'm going to say, a minimum of lines on her print over on the left, was able to capture her own image. That's a photograph of Kollwitz on the right with economy of means that is pretty impressive. She is most famous for her prints. Printmaking allowed her to create multiple copies that could reach the masses. She often also works in cycles. She's basically a storyteller, and I think we'll sense that in a moment when we look at a couple of her relatively famous prints. As a woman artist in Germany, as in other parts of Europe as well, she was not allowed, in America, let me throw in, she was not allowed to attend the same school that male artists went to. So she had to go to a school for women artists, not the traditional academy that the males were taught in. Nevertheless, she's a pretty impressive presence in terms of the art world, and she managed to work throughout her long life, even in the times of Adolf Hitler's command over the world of art, and keeping a low profile as she did, she was able to continue the work that she was doing. Her images often may appear to be anti war, and I think that in fact they are. She lived through both World War I and World War II. In the First World War, she lost her son. In the Second World War, she lost her grandson. She also saw the suffering of the poor during the period of the Depression between the First World War and the Second World War because she married a doctor and they were living in a relatively poor area of Berlin, serving a clinic, essentially, clientele, the folks who had very little money. Consequently, she's very sympathetic to the people who suffered in Germany, and that would include the widows and the children who'd been left behind. These are two of Kollwitz's prints, including the one on the right, which is figure 10.27, the volunteers. It was made in 1922, so after the First World War, but before the Second, in this period of economic and probably emotional depression that Germany was living through. It is a woodcut, and I had to skip ahead in our textbook, but I think this is the appropriate place to put Kollwitz. She made art that could be produced for the masses because she hoped to make a social and a political statement. This is really a kind of protest art. It's called The Volunteers, and you can see the way in which the figures of the young are drawn to the beat of the drum. The drum is located here, being called forward to war or the military, and you can see these curving lines continue essentially around from the volunteers to this is our drummer. And our drummer is actually an image of death. So the young men are following death into the battlefield. There is a kind of the lines that connect them actually act as a kind of a halo linking them all together, but linking them together in a cause that is futile, that will do no good for anyone. This is, I think, pretty strongly a statement that is anti war. Created by a woman who has firsthand seen the suffering of war through her own loss, but also through living through uh, the wars and the depression in between in Germany and watching other women suffer. That would be true for over on our left, the widow. And I'd like you to take a look at her, another print where all of the white areas have been cut away and the black ink captures the portion of the block that stands up. That includes, if you take a look at the background here, little splintered areas that almost for me look like blood. The woman draws her exaggerated hands across her body as if to protect herself from the sorrow that she's feeling. And we can tell the source of that because the title of Kollwitz's image is The Widow. So it's someone who has lost her loved one, and the implication is lost during the war. She's left alone to fend for herself, feels the grief of the loss, but with the way the hands curve across the body of the woman, I would also like to suggest that she's pregnant, having been left alone without a husband to help her in very dire circumstances. This is a woman that we are intended to feel a great sense of grief and sorrow for, and that was Kollwitz's idea to make a kind of statement about the great loss and suffering of the survivors of war. The use of exaggerated hands in terms of scale, enlarging them and using them expressively that we saw in Widow is going to occur again here in figure 10.29 in our textbook, which is called Lamentation. This is an image that's meant to express the grief at the loss of one of Kollwitz's friends, a sculptor whose name was Ernst Barlach. Consequently, this is done as a sculptural image to pay homage to him. I have two more self-portraits of her over on the right. Both of them, by the use of these rather enlarged hands again, express grief and sorrow, and also, I think, self-examination. In the sculpture that we're looking at, the figure conveys, through exaggerations and distortions, this unbearable pain at the loss of someone dear. And again, we're getting back to the ideas of the pain for the survivors. The eyes are closed as if to shut out the realities of what has actually happened. This is a bronze relief sculpture. That means it's basically created against a backdrop, a little bit like an image on a penny that rises from the surface. She is, after all, basically a two-dimensional sculptor rather. So when she turns to sculpture, it also remains two-dimensional, not fully in the round. She is heavily influenced by Rodin and his expressive use of body language, highly expressionistic in particular, with the use of hands to convey suffering. This is to look at as we finish Kollwitz. It is a piece that she designed for her own tomb. She often works with the theme of death, and in death, it is actually possible for the artist to find peace. The name of this is Rest in the Peace of His Hands, and it was a work that she did in the 1930s for her own tomb. Again, the hands I think are exaggerated, but in this case, I'd like you to see the face of the dead person, and for her own tomb, that would mean herself, and her tiny hand here, with great calm and great peace, being held protectively and gently in the hands of God. So it is a piece that actually, I think, could convey the idea of solace coming through death as you're cradled by the Lord. And in troubled times, it's escaping the pain and suffering of this world, particularly the world of Germany in the first half of the 20th century. A pretty powerful piece of sculpture, but again, this is relief sculpture. It is not 3D. This is Oscar Kokoschka, who does sign his paintings OK, his initials. He was an expressionist from Vienna who is a very, very powerful painter. I've linked him with Kollwitz because both of them rely heavily on the exaggeration of hands as a symbolic device to convey feeling, emotion, and to help to tell the story. This is a self-portrait of Kokoschka. And I think you can see he's holding his paintbrush a little bit like a weapon. You can also see that the surface of the paint is rich and clumped and bumpy. It is not done in the academic style. Kokoschka, and of course Austria comes under the control of Hitler. Kokoschka is going to recognize he has to get out. He isn't going to be able to stay under the control of the Nazis and work, so he will flee and he will establish himself outside of Germany and continue working through the war. and use his brush very much as a weapon. But the weapon for Kokoschka is in revealing the inner states of human beings, the psychological states. And I would like you to think that Austria is the home, essentially, of Sigmund Freud. So a lot of work in psychology was coming out of this region about the same time. Kokoschka also is an individual who did serve, this time in World War I, and he served on the Eastern Front, and he was wounded and left for dead. He did recover, but the recovery was very, very difficult. It did cause him some mental problems. I'm going to suggest anxiety that never went away, I believe, and that is a bit of a product of his own history that is going to influence his works of art. He is in these examples of art going to focus upon the inner states of his subjects in a very psychological way. Always with Kokoschka, look for the rough surface of paint, look for the hands also. Let's take a look at his famous painting right here. This is Oscar Kokoschka's Bride of the Wind, which is figure 6.33 in our textbook. And it is a depiction of Oscar Kokoschka himself with his lover, Alma Mahler. And I've included a photograph of Alma so you can see what this lady looks like. She was, at least for a portion of her life, Kokoschka's muse, but she was a kind of woman who was constantly attracted to famous men, particularly artistically famous men. I think she fed on them. She ended up marrying Gustav Mahler, a great composer of classical music. She was also involved with the poet Franz Werfel, and she was also again involved with an architect, famous one, named Walter Gropius. So she seemed to gravitate towards creative giants and famous individuals. I cannot tell you that she was ever completely devoted to them. And I think that may be revealed in this painting in terms of the way in which Kokoschka has analyzed the relationship of the two people, himself and Alma Mahler. As they move through a windswept landscape, I can also almost say a cloudscape. This is what Kokoschka had to say about it to Alma in a letter about this picture. Quote, I was able to express the mood I wanted by reliving it. Despite all the turmoil in the world, to know that one person can put eternal trust in another, that two people can be committed to themselves and other people by an act of faith. Wow, that sounds like these two people are very much in love and completely intertwined and committed. However, if you look very closely at this picture and I were to ask you which one of these figures is most secure and most comfortable, I think you're going to say it's Alma. For Kokoschka, in contrast to Alma's relaxed body as she leans and almost sleeps against him, he seems stiff and nervous, and he pulls away from Alma, and his hands almost fidget. There is a kind of inner turmoil as Kokoschka is depicting the nervous energy of his own inner state and his awareness that he really cannot ever permanently and successfully connect with Alma Mahler. These are two more images of Alma and Oscar. Both of them reveal that rough paint surface, thick paint on the surface that Oscar Kokoschka is famous for, and also kind of flickering light across the surface that animates this and makes it more intensely emotional. In both of them, also, though, the body language is conveyed, and in particular, conveyed through the use of hands. If we take a look at the couple in the larger picture right here, and look at those hands, you're going to see that Oscar is showing that he's the one who has to reach out to Alma, and she's kind of holding back again from him, but the hands are not meeting, they're not touching, they're not enclosed. Just as in the upper right, we do get the sense that the couple, while engaged in the dance, are not really dancing together as partners. The detail on the lower right is from Bride of the Wind. It shows you the hands a little more clearly. You can see, I think, without difficulty, that Kokoschka is using body language, heavy paint on the surface of the composition, but one of his key elements is hands, which he often exaggerates, enlarges, and places in a prominent position as a kind of symbol of the relationship or the nature of the couple if it's two people, or the personality of the individual if it is a single person being painted in his picture. A tremendously powerful expressionist who lived a rich life by escaping Nazi Germany.